So welcome back. The strongest, I guess. We still have some more exciting things to look forward to. First of all, we are going to have a plenary lecture by Professor Poul Holm, titled Public Humanities, Activism, Practice and Social Change. That's the name of the program, sorry. Yes, Shifting Baselines, Making History Matter for Ocean Management. Sorry. So Poul Holm is Professor of Environmental History at Trinity College Dublin, as well as Vice President of the Academia Europaea, and Chair of the Humanities class in particular that he used to do from 2018 to 2025, and a former President of the European Alliance for the Social Sciences and Humanities. His research focuses on human exploitation of the sea. Over the past 25 years, he has led major research projects that have established marine environmental history as a new and productive field of collaboration between the humanities and the natural sciences. So I suppose we can rank you under blue humanities, this new field that is emerging. So from 2021 to 27, funded by the European Research Council, he's leading a team to build a world atlas of human marine exploitation over the last 2 millennia. His most recent publications include, for example, Historical Marine Footprint for Atlantic Europe from 1500 to 2019, Exploiting and Managing the Alien and Unseen World Below Water, in the collection titled Before SDGs, a historical companion to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, New Challenges for the Human Ocean Past Agenda, and Accelerated Extractions of North Atlantic Cod and Herring, and I guess many more. So before I give the floor to Professor Peter Holm, there is one practical announcement now that we are joined by more people. First of all, there is a change of schedule for tomorrow. Tomorrow, the last plenary is cancelled. If you look at your programs, it is the one that was to take place from 3:30 to 5 o'clock. Instead, we will jump right over to the roundtable discussion. So the roundtable discussion will be at 3:30. After that, a break, and then the graduation party as scheduled. And after this plenary is over, everyone will go together to the Science Slam. So we'll leave this room all together, and there will be some treats and wine, as I heard. And thank you for patience. Now it's my pleasure to give the floor to Professor Peter Holm.
Poul Holm.
Poul Holm.
That's good. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me, and it's a real pleasure to be back in Tallinn. I will be telling you a story of shifting baselines, making history matter for ocean management and coastal communities. And in order to make sure that you all have the take-home message, the next slide is the take-home message. Basically, what I'll be arguing is that humanity's insights into ocean change is an enormously powerful source of information, both for understanding the past and for how we manage and imagine future oceans. So basically, when you look at the ocean today, you are looking at a desert. We have fished down the big fish. We have exterminated a lot of the breeding grounds by concretizing our coastal landscapes. We have trawled out not just the fish, but also many of the natural reefs of the ocean. So if you look at this infographic, you can see in the middle, this is where we are at. But when you go back in time, you will be able to identify that there is a story of degradation of the oceans through not just recent years, but actually, as we have discovered, through the last few centuries. This matters, of course, for how we interpret human history. It matters for understanding how much wealth have we derived from the oceans, the monetary, the food sources, how it has energized communities. But it also has resonance for how we imagine the future, because the oceans are not like the Serengeti in Africa. In the open plains, you can shoot all the wildebeest, you can shoot all the lions, you can shoot all the elephants. And once they are shot in that open landscape, they're not coming back. The oceans are deep. They are three-dimensional. And that means that marine life can find shelter, can hide from humans. And that also means that if we stand back, if we let ecology have a chance to revive, we can rebuild the ocean life that used to be there, or at least most of what used to be there, because there are things that are lost forever. But this provides us with potential to look into what we have lost in order to imagine what we could gain by introducing sensible management. And therefore, historical insights are enormously powerful. And this is not just about the historical data. It's also about the imagery. It's about the stories that can be told. It's about the communities that have been lost or are being derived of purpose along many of our coasts. In recent years, in many of the northern European countries, we have closed down any number of fishing ports. In Denmark alone, between 2005 and 2015, they closed 25 fishing harbors, active fishing ports. So this is a cultural and social destruction that is directly responding to the desertification of the ocean. So not only are we losing marine life, we are also losing coastal life. So that's the take-home message, that we can derive benefits from humanity's insights into oceans past in order to imagine ocean futures. So my talk today will deal with first establishing the ocean crisis really quickly, talk about how the humanities are informing this. Then I will turn to how can the public humanities intervene, be made of practical use. I'll give, for starters, an example from a project that we have undertaken in Dublin. I'll then move on to say, in more principled ways, how can we inform management? How can we inform communities? And then, obviously, although this is in many ways an optimistic message, there are objections, there are challenges to humanities' insights, and I'll talk about some of these. I'll end by talking about opportunities and doing right. So, ocean crisis, well, this is the one image of the ocean crisis. This is how we have basically exhausted the oceans globally. So this is 1950 to 2020. The overall extractions of marine life, so all the food we derive from the oceans. And you can see it peaked around about 1995. In the last 20 years, we have been unable to increase the amount of food we are getting from wildlife in the oceans. Fisheries have peaked in ecological terms of course, not in economic terms, because as the food is becoming scarcer, it's also becoming more expensive. That means we in the Western world are not experiencing any kind of food shortage from the oceans because we are able to afford the higher prices. But in places like West Africa, the ocean crisis is very real in the diets of ordinary people. Now, there's a solution to this. You might say, well, aquaculture will sort it out, won't it? And if we look at aquaculture, this is the recent trajectory. It's on a steep increase. But however, you should look at the actual, and let me see if this pointer works. It does not. Anyway, you can identify the lower blue part. That's the actual fish produced in aquaculture. Most of the stuff that we generate in these aquaculture plants is aquatic plants and mollusks, which are perfectly fine human food, but probably not what we would expect. And our palate is not really geared to enjoy what is coming out of the aquacultured plants. So we are still seeing an enormous increase in the supplies of salmon. Salmon is the chicken of the oceans, people famously say, but reality is it's a tiny proportion of the overall amount of food that we could potentially get from the oceans. So the ocean crisis is a food crisis. Not for us, somebody else. How do we convey this change in the oceans? How do we impress that rather bland graph into something that's memorable? A PhD student, Lauren McClenaghan, came up with this very powerful imagery. What she did for her PhD thesis was she studied the fisheries off Key West in Florida. And she came to this one particular tourist organization that had been in place since 1958. And they have sent out every day tourists for adventure fishing, and every time you returned, there would be, of course, a picture taken of your catch of the day. So the top figure is the best catch of 1958. The bottom picture is the best catch of 2007. It doesn't take much convincing to realize that something dramatic has happened in the inshore waters of southern Florida. This is coming out, screaming at us, something has gone horribly wrong in this particular region. So we have this overall picture of an ocean crisis that is a human crisis in terms of a food crisis. And that caused the then Commissioner for Fisheries and Maritime Affairs, Commissioner Vella, to ask in 2017, how can more food and biomass be obtained from the oceans in a way that does not deprive future generations of their benefits? The question was asked to the Science Advice for Policy by European Academies, SAPER. So this is a consortium of all the European academies. Academia Europaea is one. To respond to this by mobilizing the best possible advice in a short time frame of 6 to 8 months. So no new research required, just tell us what you think could be done. And the academies responded very quickly by identifying a group of people to address this, and I was asked to co-chair this advisory body with Dag Axeland from the University of Bergen. He's a marine scientist. I am, of course, a historian. So you would say, why on earth would they ask a historian for this kind of science advice? That's not what they do, is it? Actually, it is. It is in line with the European research advisory best protocols to include all the sciences. And by saying sciences, it also includes the human sciences, or as they are known in the Anglophone world, the humanities. So not so hard to understand. And of course, the reasoning behind this is that not only do we need to have the best possible advice from the technical side and from the ecological side, we also need to know how are human communities responding to this, what is the applicability in policy terms. So we needed a large group of people, political scientists and engineers and everything in between, to be a member of about 20 people. So we conducted this in a few months and then presented it, and the report was approved by the EU Commission in February 2018. Did anything come out of this? Very often I'm met with this slightly cynical approach. Well, yes, you can talk science to powers, but will they actually respond? In this case, I would say the response was very positive. Not only did we get a very friendly welcome at the Commission, but the advice was woven into the regulations for the EU 2020 Maritime and Fisheries Fund, which is basically the main economic mechanism for the European Union to influence how we utilize the oceans. So quite a positive outcome of this. Of course, a lot of the advice that we gave is up in the air. It really depends on our ability to change behavior. And one of the big, possibly the biggest request we had was that in order to address the food crisis, we need to shift towards human consumption towards lower trophic levels. That means we need to eat more plants, less of the top. We even know that the population of the world will grow in the next few decades. Only 2% of the human food currently comes from the ocean. So there's huge potential, huge potential. But it will not happen if we are on the trajectory of that first graph that I showed, because the oceans will not yield more. So we need to make better use of the food that is generated by the ocean. And in order to make better use of it, we need to shift our dietary preferences. To the right, you can see how we derive most of our foods from cereals or from other stuff, chicken, which are fairly low at the food chain. So for each step you take in this hierarchy, there is a loss of about 90% of energy. So eating from the top is hugely wasteful. Eating from the bottom generates much more food for everybody. So we sort of do it all right in terms of terrestrial production. We are eating a lot of vegetable foods. We could eat more, but we are doing okay. When we look at the oceans, we are eating the tigers of the ocean. We are eating from the very top. We are eating the tuna, the cod, all the top predators that really can only exist by this whole loss of energy through the food web. So if we could shift our consumption down to plants, we would immediately generate so much more food for ourselves. However, we are not prepared to do that. Everybody knows that in recent years we have had the sushi revolution. Has certainly caused an increase in top predator consumption. We don't really, when we sit at the table, think too much about the food that we're eating and where it comes from and what are the environmental consequences. So how can we address this? How can we make an effective intervention? So as a result of this experience, I, with colleagues, dreamt up this project called the Food Smart Dublin project. I was actually trying to implement some of the insights that we had generated. The idea was to say, well, Dublin is a typical European metropolis in many ways. People are not too concerned about the environment, yet we are surrounded by a heritage bay, which is identified as a UNESCO resort, a biosphere which is fished down. There's not that much life left relative to what there used to be. But the waters are clean because we have now cleaned up our acts. It is actually consumable. And we could perhaps try and regenerate life there and generate also some food from this area. So Dublin has a famous heritage of using the cockles and mussels of the streets as the sweet Molly Malone wheeled her wheelbarrow through streets broad and narrow, crying, "Cockles and mussels, alive, alive, oh!" So there was a time when this was a usual diet, no longer is, but could we try and introduce this again, encourage people? So a little group of people with my colleague in zoology, Nessa O'Connor, and a marine scientist, Kotla Shearer, and a digital humanist, Richard Breen, and a social scientist, Agnese Catella, we formed a little coalition to try and see if we could do something in partnership with restaurants and with schools. So what we did was we said, in order to really make the best of this, we need to identify how people used to live off the sea, identify some old recipes, see if that could be revitalized, identify perhaps the availability of seafood in the Dublin Bay, and try and support a healthy, sustainable consumption of seafood. So this involved, of course, some humanistic work. We needed to go to the archives to identify recipes. We needed to make sure that all of this was identified in the old letters and correspondences. And then we took it to chefs, because the problem with historical recipes is that it's not really perhaps well suited to a modern palate. So these chefs needed to look into the recipes and see how can we revitalize these recipes so that it would actually work in a modern restaurant. And then we would also want to call on everyday citizens to try and replicate these recipes. So we had a call to have volunteers to cook the recipes in their home kitchens. And we had a website where they could feed back their experiences. And was it really practical? Could they source the kind of food ingredients that we recommended, etc.? So we did surveys of people in the restaurants. We did surveys of families. Is this really working? Is it too difficult to cook this? And we also wanted, of course, to engage school children. So we worked with UNESCO, which is the organization that engages school children across Dublin in experimental workshops. And this was happening during COVID. So unfortunately, we couldn't bring everybody together in big industrial kitchens. The chefs needed to converse with the school children online to direct them to cook the meals at home. But we could go to the beach, and at the beach we could have workshops to engage with some of the wider context, both historical and ecological, of these recipes. And finally, when we had done all of this, Agnese and Cordula gathered all the evidence together in a cookbook, 1 year of Irish seafood. And it's freely available. You can go online and just download it and see if you want to replicate some of this. And it comes complete with the historical backdrop. When and where was this food being eaten, and what is the ecological impact of eating this particular recipe? So lots of benefits here, both in re-engaging with Dublin's coastal cultural heritage, raising youth awareness, and just making sure that ordinary citizens are part of co-creating research. We published the academic paper last year, which looked into the results of all of this. And note, perhaps, that the publication is not in a humanities publication, but is in marine policy, because we wanted this to make an absolute impact, and we didn't want this to be covered up in some arcane humanistic journal. I'm sorry. We needed to address the audience that we know will be in need of this evidence, and these people read marine policy. So there you have it. So it's designed to that kind of audience. So moving on to the wider picture of informing management. So basically what we can say is coming out of all of this effort is we need to shift the baseline. And the baseline is this, that managers will think of the present day, and I'm told I can move to the screen, so I will. This is what managers look at. This is what fishers are looking at desertificated ocean. And they will say, well, our statistics show us that in the past there used to be a bit more. We can probably regenerate that by introducing some management system. And this would be fairly uncontroversial. However, the grandparents may say, well, actually, there used to be plenty more fish in the ocean in the good old days. And people will say, oh, come on, you're getting old. You're just dreaming up. We can't trust these stories. Well, maybe go to the historical archives. We can actually demonstrate that there used to be quite a bit more. And when we do go to the archives, and when we do go to all the evidence that we can generate, we realize that very often the decline is monumental, something which nobody had foreseen. So how do we do it? Well, we can use all sorts of evidence. We can use historical experiments like copying the drying processes of fish, or we can go to monasteries such as this Russian monastery by the White Sea and pick out how much salmon used to run in Russian rivers. We can go to the Caribbean, dig down these reefs, artificial reefs, which are actually remnants of pre-Columbian indigenous fishing. Or we can go to the North Sea, of course, and find the mundane herringbone, cod bone. Or we can look up in logbooks, whaling logbooks, or whatever. So it's a diversity of information that unites archaeologists, historians, art historians, and literary scholars to some degree to really populate our understanding of the past. So we've done that for quite a couple of decades now. And in 2010, we published Marine Animal Populations, a New Look Back in Time. And that year was really influential as well, because the International Council for the Exploration of the Seas had a meeting, and they took a vote amongst delegates. Can we trust historical evidence, and should it inform us for management in the future? And amazingly, the vote was carried. We were not only accepted, respected, we were actually given the official seal of being allowed to inform fisheries managers. So this is a major breakthrough. I would say something that we should celebrate, and it's not widely known, but in this instance, it's just one example, of course, out of the multitude of places where evidence of the past, as generated by humanities scholars, could inform the present, could inform policy and communities. But in this case, it was actually voted. I take some joy in knowing that. Since then, a lot of studies have been published, and they have actually influenced, been picked up by users of historical data for management. On the right-hand side, you can see the CSIRO of Australia, NIWA in New Zealand, the NOAA in the US, Canada, the Baltic HELCOM, European Commission, etc. So a lot of this is actually making its way through, and the typical thing is it's a combination of humanities scholars working with natural scientists. That's typically what is taking place. In this one case that I'll take you through, it's not always simple. Here is the Gulf of Maine. The yellow line there indicates what fisheries managers, ecologists, identified as the total cod biomass through the last couple of decades. Then you can see it's about 100,000 tons, going down to a very low point. So fisheries managers have said we need to rebuild to the historical maximum of 100,000 tons. So that's the aim. In come the historians. The idea dawned on William Leavenworth and others that we have this 3,000 records of logbooks from the 1850s that have been preserved in the archives in Boston and around. What if we bring all of that together and try and remodel how much cod was actually in the Gulf of Maine? They came up with a figure that was not 100,000 tons biomass, but 1.2 million tons biomass. Now this is staggering, and it met, of course, with a lot of resentment or doubt. But it stood up against modeling, which was replicated, and that's the stippled line there, which actually replicated what is the productivity of the Gulf of Maine, and it is above 1.1 million tons. So ecologists and historians were in agreement. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that it immediately is picked up by fisheries managers. This was too extreme, so the reality is management of the Gulf of Maine is still not heeding the historical advice. It's not possible, they would say, to regenerate that. In other cases, historians are coming to the rescue at the very last moment. This is Neil Clare, did his PhD in Sydney. He realized that the Australian Fisheries Agency were dumping its records. And he actually went to the actual dump site to salvage the records of the fisheries company, which had been recording, because it had received state subsidies since 1918, exactly how much fish was caught in the waters around Sydney, Botany Bay. And when he compiled all of that evidence, he realized that there was what is known as a regime shift, that in the first couple of decades, the redfish was dominating the catches. That's the green part there. By the 1940s, the redfish had almost been fished out. By the 1950s, they had virtually gone. Instead, this was the flathead, and by the 1950s, the redfish had taken over. So what's the significance of this? Well, in terms of culinary preference, it meant that the flathead was really preferred because it resembled the haddock. So it was the fish and chips. It was building on the British cultural preference. They had to shift because the flathead was fished out. In ecological terms, of course, it means that we are looking at a drastically changed environment. The flathead is not coming back because of the regime shift. Other fish are simply eating the stuff that would normally sustain a flathead population. So if you have the CSIRO, the Australian ocean managers, and they are trying to manage the ocean in a sustainable way, they will never be able to rebuild the ocean back to where it used to be. We are looking at a depleted, in many ways, desertificated ocean. So that was the message coming out of that. And of course, all of this information can be shared with all sorts of authorities. This is the development of the state of environment impact, which is recommended by all UN authorities and is being implemented, for example, in Sweden, basically calling on historians to populate this West Coast atlas with historical evidence of what used to live there. How much did we used to take out? But it's not just about informing management. It's also about informing communities. And communities have very different needs. Management wants to hear evidence. Communities want to hear stories, narratives that are powerful and can support and build identity. It's a completely different approach that calls on anthropologists, on literary scholars to really take on board the narratives that can support a coastal community. But it's also about understanding how do our culinary preferences change, how quickly can they change, and by what means do we instigate a change? Sorry. Obviously, it also comes with all sorts of questions about what are your preferences? If you talk about whaling in a Western context, you would say, everybody is in agreement. We need to protect the whale populations of the oceans. If you talk to people in Japan, they would perhaps say, we need to kill some more whales because they are eating our food. That's a Japanese cartoon that's really bringing that message across. So the audiences also have different needs for information from the humanities. We can provide the quantitative evidence to managers because they want accountability. They want to have data that they can stand over. Communities want to build identities and have narratives that will support them as they struggle with survival and build resilience. Resilience is needed by both parties. So there's huge possibilities for us as humanities scholars to delve into that. And I'll break for a little while and show you a little clip, if we can run that.
Seafood has played a vital role in human societies, providing food and generating wealth. But when did this begin? Using historical data on 25 fisheries, researchers from Trinity College Dublin have identified a fish revolution in the North Atlantic. In the 1500s, Europeans began fishing intensively for cod, using long lines, and herring, using nets. With fisheries developing in two broad regions, the Northeast and Northwest Atlantic. The researchers found two periods of increased extractions of these fish, 1540 to 1620 and 1750 to 1790, with changing climate conditions and warfare contributing to the decline in catches in between. This revolution caused fish to shift from being an expensive and limited resource to being cheaper and readily available. As a result, growing European societies had more food on their tables and experienced fewer famines. The amount of fish protein available in the European market potentially doubled. This contrasts with previous assumptions about the historical impact humans had on marine animals, particularly cod. Exploitation of the North Atlantic has a long history that, while benefiting economic growth, has led to overfishing. The oceans were previously a rich resource, but today, many fisheries are exhausted, having reached the limit of what they can provide. We have to learn from the past.
So there you go. We're trying to get this message across, but of course we're met with objections and challenges, and I'll go through how responses vary. Of course, when you look at the fisheries extractions, one of the things that we need to say is that the fishing, eating, is actually the main cause of depletion of the oceans. Fishing communities are not necessarily keen to hear that. They much rather prefer us to talk about pollution, climate change, whatever. But most of the impact that we have had is actually exploitation and habitat destruction. So that generates concern in communities. It's also not popular necessarily to go to aquaculturists and tell them that you're really experimenting like the Neolithic peasants were 10,000 years ago. But this is what is happening in aquaculture. We are living through a Neolithic revolution, which we passed through 10,000 years ago with the domestication of most of the wild animals that we live with, pigs, cows, etc. Domestication has only taken place in the last 150 years, really, for aquacultural purposes. So That generates a lot of trial and error, a lot of diseases, a lot of waste, and a lot of escapees that are genetically polluting our waters. So aquaculture is not a simple recipe. And finally, communities are also prone to look for their own facts. We are no longer living in an era where we academics were the experts and we could tell an unknowing audience that this is how it is and this is what you should do. Now, facts are out there, readily available to everyone at their fingertips. And factoids can be exploded in our heads and we can be told, well, we don't believe your history. Can you stand over this? I know that the cod is still very plentiful in this and that place, etc. So, not only are there community challenges in bringing the message across, there are also disciplinary challenges as we meet ecologists, natural scientists. They will very often say, oh, we don't have the time to listen to you historians. You always want to establish that unique fact. We just need a model. Just tell us the big, big picture, and we will say, but you can't really build a model based on lousy data. So we need to spend all that time to do it. And of course, there was also resistance within our own community. Historians don't do nature, as Collingwood famously said. So in many ways, we're still in that mindset of the NASA overview of 1988, the Earth System Science, which is basically, we know exactly and we can quantify all of these processes. And then we have a black box, which is the humans. If we only did not have that disturbing factor, everything would be manageable. And it is true, we need, in order to effectively intervene, we need that collaboration across all sorts of approaches. We need to know about a lot of abiotic stuff that I never thought I would care about, frankly, as a historian. But we also need to make sure that we bring our cultural representations to the table, that the preferences are understood as they have impact change. So summing up, we are in the middle of writing a paper which is basically to identify what are all the objections that we come up against. And these are not just in the marine world. This is what humanities very often are faced with when we try and present a picture of a long term. A long list of objections here that range from why bother when we can't turn back the clock, there are not enough data of sufficient quality, and so on. I'm not going through all of these, but there's no lack of stuff that can be thrown at you, especially when you are at a conference where you are trying to fight over the funding for next year. All of this will, of course, be put forward. But perhaps more fundamentally, a recent objection is the no analog future objection, which is, it sounds actually sort of environmentally friendly in a way, because it's basically arguing that climate change changes everything so dramatically that the future will be no analog. It will not replicate the past. And therefore we can dispense with past evidence. We don't need it. And that is articulated here in the Arctic Council. In the Arctic, future environmental conditions are increasingly uncertain, rendering data on past conditions questionable as guides to future dynamics. So there's a hard pushback here to this idea that we need to learn from the past. But there are opportunities as well. clearly what we are doing should inform the Ocean Decade. The United Nations have declared this decade the decade of ocean science for sustainable development. The science we need for the ocean we want, exactly our agenda, and calling on all sorts of objectives, which are all very good. And it was launched in 2020 at a preparatory meeting in the UN headquarters. Lots of people there. Unfortunately, when you count the humanists, there was one. João Paulo Oliveira e Costa is the UNESCO chair of ocean history. And he got 2 minutes to say that we cannot live without a healthy ocean as much as we cannot live without the evidence of our common history. So we are trying to raise our voice, but we are also being drowned out by a lot of loud voices that want to focus funding towards other areas. Of course, we can point then to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and say, well, look at these goals for life below water. We can certainly provide evidence for all of this. However, the United Nations have decided that in order to have trust in the signals, in the evidence base, they cut off all historical evidence before 2014. So we are managing the oceans relative to a 2014 baseline. So we are really in a situation where we're going blind into the future. We are not relying on the historical data to inform us. So that's the challenge. And in addition to this, SSH in general, so social sciences and humanities research, is quite literally invisible to managers. Why? Because most of this picking up of indicators, identifying what is trusted evidence, is coming out of science papers that are keyworded in very particular ways. So I worked with John Deere of the University of London, who is an expert in bibliometrics, and what he came up with is this problem that SDG 14, that's the life below water keywords, show that 97% of all research is produced by 50 scientific fields, only 3.3% from the social sciences and humanities. So a lot of the evidence that we are providing is simply not channeled through. It's lost in translation. So it's on us to make sure that our evidence is better communicated. But we have huge opportunities. The agenda of ocean literacy is now a well-established, broad-scale approach to reform of curricula, both in North America and in Europe. Ocean literacy is simply about making school children more familiar with life in the oceans, to try and build a platform. The EU for Ocean platform is one example of this, to try and build on that engagement with school children to have a better understanding of the environmental impact of human action. So I've tried to convince you that history and the humanities broadly may improve our understanding of the past, that's a given, provide baselines for management targets, both in terms of what used to live there and the habitats that we have lost, and empower people in their choices as consumers and citizens. It does take an awful lot of time to overcome the disciplinary boundaries that we are struggling with. Just getting natural scientists and historians and art historians, literary scholars to talk to each other is quite a stretch. We've worked through a few decades of trying this out, but we have done some social innovation, I would say. In this particular field of humanities, we have established a very strong platform, which is now called the Oceans Past Initiative, which has a world conference every second year, but also a newsletter, and really tries to make sure that we overcome the disciplinary boundaries, and we have also been successful in getting some funding to do this. We are looking at struggles. We are still confronted with the stereotypes, but we can overcome it by simply acting together. Ultimately, we are united in building a set of models and narratives that build on evidence, that are strong storylines, that are building both on the qualitative and the quantitative information, that are credible because we are, as I would put it, truth-seeking. Truth is not out there, but we can seek it. Strive better. And we can build a historical rather than a temporal snapshot of narratives. Ultimately, in order to do all of this, we need to collaborate. I opened by giving a Dublin example. I will end by this, a picture of all my colleagues at the Trinity Center for Environmental Humanities. We are a very diverse bunch of people, not all of us marine. We have experts in peatlands, we have experts in classical Egypt and hydraulic systems and whatnot. We have archaeologists, we have historians, we have biologists, we have people trained in mathematics who can help us develop some of the ecological modeling that we need as well. It's just one example of how it can be done, but I think the agenda is obvious. We as humanists have a lot to offer to the world. The world may not always be willing to listen, and there is certainly competition for funding. We should not be deterred. There is possibility, and if we collaborate, we are in a much better, stronger position. Thank you so much.
So thank you so much, Professor Poul Holm, for this very engaging and I would say even hopeful talk. I am sure there are lots of questions and maybe responses to follow up on the ideas that came as inspiring. So please indicate. Yes.
Thank you for this talk. I was really amazed of this incredible example of incorporating not only different researchers, but also the school children and the chefs and everyone in the community. That definitely comes with problems also with communication and whatever. My question is, what were your experience, and what was the most difficult thing to achieve or make work, and how did you solve it? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I'd say the challenge is really to challenge is the university as an organization. I'll just tell you this. When I arrived in Dublin, I had to teach Viking history because no students were interested in environmental history. It was sort of, we don't do that. That has completely changed. I have no difficulty in filling the seats now. So student interest, of course, generates a certain inertia also amongst your colleagues once they realize that there is an interest. And not least, when I showed that this is eminently fundable, the mood shifted. There is a lot of funding available for this type of environmental approach. The European Union funds really, as a matter of principle, collaboration across disciplines. This is what they are looking for. So having a humanities scholar step out of the comfort zone and willingly engage with natural scientists immediately gives you a boost in all sorts of context. So I would say that is important. Seize the opportunity. Identify who can you collaborate with. Then, of course, it's really important to have a long-term sustainable agenda, because too much of what we do is funded for 2-3 years, wonderful projects, then it collapses. There's no embedding in the institution, people move away. So I think it's really important to have a look at the long-term building up of competence and knowledge infrastructure. In a field like this one, you become better and better as you develop huge databases and digital competences, archival competence, specialists in different languages who can actually talk to the needs of a certain project. That takes time. To build that level of expertise is difficult in the humanities because we are relatively poor compared to the natural sciences. The natural sciences come with a lot of overhead. We tend not to. So that's why we have these blips, and then it's gone, blip, and it's gone. It really takes substantial funding. I have been fortunate to have very substantial funding, not least in the last 10 years from the European Research Foundation. So that enables you to build this. And then you need, of course, to convince the institution that this is a growth area, to have new posts in place. So it's a long game, but it can be done. Now we have 4 tenured positions in place. So it gives security and a long term, which is otherwise really difficult. If you don't have that, you can't be strategic. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. More questions? Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I have a question about this negotiation and ocean as a place of negotiation, rather. For example, in certain communities, like if you go up north, like you have the Inuit community, for them, fishing is extremely important and a part of their culture. And at the same time, there's the need to preserve biodiversity. So in such challenging and difficult situations, can an Eurocentric perspective of ethics overpower needs of communities or vice versa?
Yeah, very important question. And of course, this being a very global approach to environmental history, we are faced with these issues. And it's something you can really only overcome it by inviting people on board. It wouldn't help for me to, I have actually taught in Nuuk in Greenland. It's very difficult. There is an enormous divide. There's a lot of interest. Lots of people really interested in hearing about this. But for impact, for take-up, you need to listen to people, and they need to be part of the research project. We have a new project, which I didn't talk about, which is called Coastal Tales, which is working with indigenous people in Alaska. who are developing, who are in a very precarious situation on Kodiak Island. They are trying to preserve their community and build some sense of resilience. It's only by providing funds to help them do what they want to do, and at the same time learning from them, that we can credibly also understand and bring some insights to this. So it's difficult. It's something which funders typically don't want to fund. But in this case, it's the Belmont Forum, which is an intergovernmental organization which is directly oriented towards helping community co-generated research. So, yeah, you are absolutely right. Challenge.
Yes, thank you. More questions and ideas, maybe? Yes, please.
Thank you. Hi. It really will be an idea instead of a question. But thank you for your talk. I'm a historian, Ruuta, and it really inspired me as a historian because I'm not sure how common my idea that started to form in my head as a historian is in this room. But looking at the example of Dublin local and seasonal food and this project to bring it out of cultural heritage, what I started thinking about is what we are complaining when living here in Estonia is the price of tomatoes, the price of fresh vegetables, greens in the grocery store. And at the same time, last year, the Estonian traditional food mulgipuder, or the fool's porridge, gained UNESCO I'm not sure completely of the word, but it became UNESCO heritage. And what are the ingredients for mulgipuder? It's potato, it's groats, small pieces of meat, maybe onion or something like that. And if we go to the grocery store and we buy the ingredients for the fool's porridge, we're gonna pay less than for maybe two fresh tomatoes. But I haven't seen anywhere anyone linking these two things, that maybe the price of tomatoes should inspire us to eat something that the locals ate here 100 years ago, 200 years ago, because they would not have fresh tomatoes on their table. So maybe an idea to reflect on and inspiration for dinner in 2 days, because I guess now we are, for these few days, we are covered from the catering.
Thank you. Yeah. No, just to say that, yes, food is both an environmental impact and an enormous source of just connecting with people. Everybody knows about food and have opinions. So it's a wonderful connector and opens up to all sorts of disciplinary approaches. So yeah, go for it.
Just to mention that in our Center for Environmental History at Tallinn University, there are also food scholars who
Yes.
Research traditional food and have also courses in which they cook with students. So that is really something of a hot topic, I would say. Any more questions or ideas to follow? Yes, please.
Thank you. That's such a nice example of integrated research. I'm really interested in the UN not buying into this yet. And I wondered if I could take you back to your question to me, which is the one about democratization of knowledge. Your material is out there, almost all of it's open access. How optimistic are you that simply doing that can change the nature of the public conversation so that eventually it gets traction somewhere as difficult to penetrate as the UN?
Yes, well, I think the UN is sort of the ultimate goal. Lots of examples. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is something that really ought to be taking on board humanity's insights. With Verena Winnewater a few years ago, we did a count of how many experts are actually invited on board, and I think in the last report they used 490 something experts, and don't quote me on the figures, but 490 social science and humanities experts, right? That's a sizable number. Half of them economists, very large number of them people who self-identify as social scientists, but in sort of a non-distinct way. Most of them actually policy makers, so from all sorts of realms. When you looked at the humanities, one historian, a PhD student, not to say anything bad about PhD students, but it is an indication that it's perhaps not targeting a particular environment and trying to generate information. 5 philosophers, amazing, all specialists in economic philosophy. So that sort of was a disheartening experience then. I think 1 or 2 psychologists. You would think, obviously, if you want to impact, change people's behavior, you would want to have some more people on that. No, from communication science. It was just a depressing overview. We published it in Environmental Science Journal, and it just makes the point that there's a huge missed opportunity. To some degree, you could say, well, it's because we in the humanities don't knock on the doors enough, and that is true. We don't go to the door, and we certainly don't sit down at the table and say, I'm not leaving, because I have as much a right to be here as you, and you need to listen to me as well. That's hard. I've done that any number of times. It is such a psychological demand on you to be sitting in these audiences and knowing that most of the people would rather see you leave because you're just annoying. However, you don't change things if you don't push back and say, well, actually, you need to listen to this. This is important. So, am I optimistic? Yeah, I think the European Union has a very sensible research policy. The humanities are definitely respected and part of the agenda. For the European Research Council, for many of the Horizon Europe projects, not so much, because most of the evaluators are not from the humanities. So it's a struggle, but it can be changed. I think it will be changed. In North America, I'm very devoid of hope. We know the impact of the last Trump administration, and it's not just his administration. It has been a quite clear policy over a couple of decades that the NSF grants are not open to the humanities, of course, but even you have NSF calls now, before Trump has come in, which is not using climate change as part of the wording. All of that nonsense, which will impact us. I do think in Mexico, for example, huge hope. Lots of people are really stepping up to and articulating, doing really good research. So we should not give up. There's plenty of hope. The United Nations it's a long haul, but I can say that at this year's Ocean Science Conference in Nice, in France, we tried to have a presentation at the regular conference, didn't succeed, but we will hopefully have a side event to showcase some of this. So it's it's important that we keep banging on about this. It takes stamina. And that's why I think it is important that an organization like the Oceans Past Initiative is building on a community. No single scholar will have the stamina to keep doing this. So it's basically about us getting better organized, collaborating more. I think that's key. Yeah. I try to be optimistic.
Yes, that's important to sustain our optimism. Marek?
Yeah, I wanted to build my question on a remark that Helen Small did just by the end of her talk, that maybe we should not add new labels to humanities, such as digital humanities and other kinds of humanities, because any other discipline is not practicing this that's so much. And in a way, I think it's a very valid point. And this reminded me that here, 2 years ago, when we had the previous winter school, was one of the keynote speakers, your colleague, Professor Sverker Sörlin from Stockholm. And one of his points he made was that what we should be aiming for is to have for humanities the similar position in our knowledge economy as we have for sciences. So we say that's science. And then we say digital humanities, environmental humanities, blue humanities, energy humanities, all kinds of humanities. And instead of populating this field with various new labels, we might try to work toward one single humanities, which is kind of integrative humanities, and because there is all humanities should be environmental, and to a certain extent all humanities should be digital, and so on and so forth. So what do you think about this? And this maybe actually is something that would also help to foster the position of humanities in our contemporary knowledge ecology.
Yes, no, I think it's a really good observation. I think we are way too siloed, we are way too obsessed with disciplinary boundaries and not collaborating across, and way too obsessed with labeling ourselves to just stand out in that petty competition between ourselves, which nobody cares about. So it's much more interesting to say, well, we bring something from I would call the human sciences, because I think the humanities, it just triggers immediately that sense that you're in the arts, aren't you? No, I'm not in the arts. I'm actually trying to do proper research, and I wouldn't be able to stand over a single product that I would present as my own craft, because it would be ridiculous. I'm not an artist. I'm not even a good storyteller. So people very often talk about us, well, the humanities, we bring good narratives. Most of us are pretty lousy storytellers, and we don't write that sort of literature. So let's stand on what we actually do, which is the critical examination of evidence and presenting that evidence in the service of society. It's no different from what the sciences do. In essence, it's exactly what all the sciences do. So why not take the label of human sciences? The French talk without problems about sciences humaines, and Germans, of course, Wissenschaften. It's just an Anglophone thing that haunts us, but really helps to denigrate us or put us, wrong foot us in so many contexts. So for political reasons, I would say, a change of label would actually help a lot. And definitely don't be too obsessed with identifying, I'm coming from this particular place of observation. Nobody cares. bring your evidence to the table, and people will listen. That's much more important. And yeah.
Thank you. Any more ideas or reactions? Okay, maybe the last one.
First of all, thank you very much for this inspiring talk. I would like you to give some advice to PhD students. And advice relates to the fact that I've been coming to those winter schools now this is my 4th one. I soon to finish my PhD, hopefully one day make it in academia, get a job, etc. And Marek already mentioned a winter school 2 years ago here in Tallinn. And at that winter school, there was very, for me, an interesting and empowering talk about medical humanities. So I thought I'm going to go to Tartu and take a course in the medical faculty. Unfortunately, they didn't let me, so I had to just read a book or something. Last year in Tallinn, there was a talk from linguists, also really interested. So I went and did a course on R coding for linguists. I liked it very much so. So today, your talk did inspire me. And I'm thinking maybe I should read more about this kind of stuff as well. But the problem is that I'm a theologian and I can write eco-theology if I want to. That's okay in my sort of disciplinary boundary. But the problem is that there is this tension between me, I actually work on Kierkegaard, being an expert in that field, being an expert on that particular topic, and all the other exciting stuff that is going on. I understand that maybe someone who is a tenured professor is more able to write about everything. But when a PhD student is at the beginning of their career, how do they make this choice, or how do they navigate this field of academia between sticking to what you did your PhD topic in and being an expert on that, but also doing some other things? Because as you mentioned, when you came to Dublin, they wanted you to teach about Viking history, and then you convinced to do something else. So how does a PhD student navigate those waters? Thank you.
Yeah, well, be really good at what you do. Make sure that you actually bring something which is unique and interesting. Make sure that you hone your language so that you contextualize it so that it becomes relevant to others. I think one of the big challenges for many students is that it feels like I need to really be very, very good at studying the poetry of Florence in the 14th, 15th century. And there's a lot of love poems there, and you lose the audience, right? But if you present yourself, and I'm quoting Maurice Piriotti, I have to self-declare, if you present yourself as a specialist in the art of love, your ears pick up, and you will then be able to tell stories about how poetry can actually bring this out. So it's about positioning your own research, not to ridicule it and not to lower its status or excuse it or in any way, because we don't want that. The humanities is a beautiful diversity of topics and approaches and all sorts of arcane things. But everything becomes interesting if you contextualize it in the right way. And once you have that interest, you will engage in conversations with other people. And they will perhaps say, but could you help me on this? Further down the road, with your textual analysis skills, could you be part of this team which is researching this, that, and the other? So I think it's really the best advice I could give is be sure to make that elevator pitch and sure to make it so that your research is not occluding the message, that you really bring out, why should I be interested? Why should I care? They're very good now, digital tools to make this happen. I have, with Helen talking this morning, I was reminded that the other day I came across this, I think it's a Google Notebook LM, yeah? No, it's Google, yeah, which is fantastic. So I took one of my old Danish language texts, an analysis of 12th, 13th century disputes over ownership of land. So it's all in academic Danish, fed it into this machine, and a few minutes later, I had these two robotic, but very good Californian voices talking about the brilliance of this analysis of Danish terrestrial ownership and the fights over it and why it's relevant today. And I thought, gosh, I could learn from that. That's not a bad exercise. It's a bit ridiculous, but it is fantastic, just to expose yourself to that. So I'm definitely going to do this in the future, just to have the machine help me get to the essence of what is it that I'm trying to say, because I myself am trapped very often in knowing too much and not really getting to the essence. How would you communicate this to somebody else? Usually I've used my wife to bring it out. She isn't really good at it, but I get a lot of scorn. The machine is very friendly, so so there you go.
So thank you very much. Our time is up. We are very good with time. I just wanted to make a final comment because you brought, I thought we won't have time for that anyway, but since you brought up this importance of the machine, or the part of the machine that is an inevitable part in our lives, what I was thinking about actually during your presentation of your very engaging project is what you did in Dublin by getting people actually to the beach, to feel the sand and the water. And this cookbook that you made is called Taste of the Ocean. So coming from my own discipline, when we think of the ocean, it's some kind of the other that is divided from us, that is in the very expression, life underwater or below the water. It's as if it's some hard surface and there is as if nothing beyond it. So we are culturally accustomed to perceive it in the framework of this conscious sublime visually, and maybe that is where the problems come from, that we see and put a conceptual framework. So what you did to me, you kind of put people back into the corporeal, olfactory relationship with water and life in it. So this machine plus the natural world, I think, could be the key to connecting, as Professor Tam suggested, many disciplines and thinking maybe without being stuck to the disciplines. So I guess you will continue over the next occasions to discuss. Thank you, everyone. Now everyone is going together to the next place where Science Slam is taking place, and there's going to be snacks and wine, so don't get lost on the way. Thanks very much. Have a nice remainder of the afternoon.
Thank you.